and it's chapter 13. Early that afternoon, we took a short walk to Baker Street Underground Station. It was good to be outdoors again, and in pleasant sunlight too. Each of us felt the change. Our mood had lifted. We put on casual clothes. Lockwood wore a long brown leather coat that emphasised his slimness and easy stride. George wore a hideous puffy jacket, the high, elasticated waistband that emphasised his bottom. And I had my usual gear: coat, roller neck, jumper, short, dark skirt, and leggings. We all wore rapiers, in my case, a spare one from the hall. These, and the cuts and bruises on our faces, were the marks of our profession and our status. People moved aside for us as we went by. The Jubilee train line was busy and heavy with the sweet, protective smell of lavender. Men wore sprigs of it in their buttonholes. Women had them in their hats. All across the carriage, silver brooches and tie pins winked and glittered beneath the neon lights. We stood silent and serious as the train rattled through the tunnels on the 5-minute journey to Green Park. No one spoke. The eyes of the crowd followed us as we alighted off the train and onto the platform. During the trip, George had been flicking through the Latin dictionary. As we went up the escalator, he took his pencil out of his mouth and made a last notation on a scrap of paper. "Okay," he said, "I've done it at last, the best I can. It's tormentium meum latitia mea, right? Well, tormentium means torment or torture. Letitia equals joy or bliss. Meum and mea are both my, so I translate the inscription on our locket as my torment, my bliss." And he snapped the dictionary shut. "Not the lengthiest of love messages, is it?" "Fits exactly what I sensed," I said shortly. It wasn't a healthy relationship. It veered between extremes. Half the time it was sort of happy, half the time eaten up by jealousy and hate. And that's what triumphed in the end. "Don't think about it any more, Lucy," Lockwood said. "You've done your bit. Now George and I will do ours. How long do you think it'll take us to get to the archives, George?" "Not long," George said. "We'll go back to the local newspapers, starting at that date where we left off. If there's any more about Annabel Ward, whether they ever arrested anyone, for instance, we should find it right away. And then we can check the gossip magazines too. It was said she was a society girl." We left the station and stared up at Piccadilly. Afternoon light lanced steeply between the tall buildings. We walked from bright sunlight to blue shadow and back again. It being late autumn, preparations for evening were already underway. A salt spreader pushed his cart alongside the road, scattering fresh grains left and right like snow. Outside the big hotels, attendants filled with braziers and bunches of dried lavenders ready for burning. Others polished the ghost lamps hanging above the doors. I let my bruised muscles stretch out as I walked. It was nice to feel my strength returning. Lockwood was limping slightly, but otherwise full of zest. He'd removed the bandages from his ghost-touched arm to let sunlight bathe his skin. "If we could solve this old case," he said, "if we can uncover the murder and let it and get justice for the girl, then it'll be brilliant publicity and totally offset the fact that we burned down that woman's house. And help us save Lockwood and Co. into the bargain," I said. "That's the hope." He steered past a man offering tourist maps of the safe zones of the city and ignored the entreaties of an iron cellar. "But only if we get good cases and get them soon." "You realise DPRAC will be working on this too," George pointed out. "It's never been their priority, but they do investigate old murders if they happened within living memory." "All the more reason to act fast," Lockwood said. "Okay, let's cross here." We ducked out across the road and stepped over the open drain or runnel of running water that separated the pavement from the tarmac. The wandering dead were known to dislike moving water. Consequently, narrow channels crisscrossed many of the great shopping streets in the West End, allowing people to walk in safety as well into the evening. Earlier governments had hoped to extend this system across the city, but it had proved prohibitively expensive. Aside from ghost lamps, the suburbs fended for themselves. Up a side road, under a great stone arch, and out onto the sweeping curve of Regent Street, not far ahead, a stand had been set up on the pavement. Flags fluttered above a cheery blood-red canopy. On each flag reared a gold heraldic lion with an ornate letter R. "Oh, look," George said, "hot chestnuts. Who wants some?" A group of boys and girls in dark red jackets were ranged around the stand, giving out free sprigs of lavender, salt bombs, and sweets to passers-by. Roasting chestnuts popped and crackled on the open brazier. An acneed youth with giant scoop stood by to tip them into paper cones. The agents' hair was carefully brushed, their swords polished, their faces scrubbed and smiling. All seemed to be pressed out of the same anemic mould. I've never seen it. Well, I have, clearly, as I've read it before, but anemic mould. They were representatives of Rotwell's, and the second oldest psychical agency in London, and, thanks to its publicity campaigns, by some sort of distance, most popular. Behind the stand, set back a little from the road, the central Rotwell office rose, a vast, smooth-fronted edifice of glass and marble. Snarling lions, holding rapiers in their forepaws, had been inscribed into the glass of its sliding double doors. I knew the interior of that office. I'd filled an interview there. A smiling boy, no more than 10 years old, held out a little cone of chestnuts as we approached. "Gift courtesy of Rotwell's," he said. "Go safe tonight." "We're not having any," Lockwood growled. "George, I want you to just walk on by." "But I'm hungry." "Tough. You're not walking down the street with one of those cones in your hand. It would be a crime to advertise a competitor." He ignored the boy and walked on past. George hesitated, then took a cone and popped it in his pocket. "There," he said, "nicely out of sight. I can say it's a crime to refuse free food." We pushed on through the pressing crowd and came out the other side. A few minutes later, we'd reached a quiet, leafy square a block behind Regent Street. It was dominated by an ugly, brick-fronted building of colossal size. A lion plaque on the door read, "National Newspaper Archives." George's spectacles gleamed. This was his territory. He had the nearest I'd seen to a smile on his chestnut-stained face. "Here we go. Keep your voices down. The librarians are picky here." He ushered us over the iron line and through the revolving doors. I'd never been in a big one. Oh, I'd never been a big one for reading as a kid. My family rarely had a book in the house, and I'd been apprenticed out to Jacob's almost before starting school. Of course, I had to read in order to complete my studies, and you can't get any of your certificates without a simple written exam. And I'd memorised the Fitz Manual for Ghost Hunters by the time I was 12. But after that, to be honest, I was too busy working to spend much time with books. True, Jacobs had occasionally sent me to the local library to look up historical details on hangings. The region around Giblet Hill and half a mile from our town being notorious as a spot for visitors. So I wasn't entirely unused to buildings full of printed paper, but the National Newspaper Archives was on a bigger scale than anything I'd ever seen. The complex had 6 enormous doors piled about a central concrete atrium. When you stood at the bottom, along the plums and the other indoor trees, the ascending levels of shelves and racks and reading tables seemed to reach to the sky. A large iron sculpture hung from the domed roof high above, part decoration, part defence. On every level, a hunched figure flipping through yellowed magazines and newspapers. Some, perhaps, researched the problem and looked for clues into the plague that beset us. Others were agents. I saw blue Tamworth jackets dotted about, the lilac tones of Grimble, and here and there were the sombre dark grey hues of Fitz. Not for the first time, I wondered why Lockwood hadn't chosen to clothe us in a coordinated uniform of our own. Like me, Lockwood seemed somewhat overawed, but George bustled us along in a confident manner. Within a few minutes, he had taken us by lift to the fourth floor, sat us down in an empty desk, after disappearing for a moment, and he plonked down the first great grey file before us. Here's the local papers from Richmond District. 49 years ago, he said. Annabel Ward disappeared late June. The article I found came out about a week or so later. Lockwood, why don't you start with the July editions? They're the most likely to be helpful. Lucy, you check the autumn file, and I'll go get some issues of London Society. Lockwood and I took off our coats and immersed ourselves obediently in the thrill-a-minute pages of the Richmond Examiner. I soon found out it contained more local fates, lost cats, and best kept allotment competitions than I could have believed existed in the universe. There was quite a bit about the problem too, the nature of which was beginning to be discussed. I found early calls for ghost lamps to be erected, and eventually they were, and for graveyards to be bulldozed and salted down. They weren't. It was far too expensive and controversial. Instead, they were simply ringed with iron. But I discovered nothing more about the hunt for the missing girl. Lockwood and George, who were flipping through the glossy black and white photos of the Society magazine, were having a similar lack of luck. Lockwood grew restless, which looked, and he looked sighingly at his watch. Shadows fell over my pages. Looking up, I discovered 3 people were standing by the table, watching us with ill-conceived amusement. Ill-concealed. Do you know what it is? My mind's a mile away. I'll keep it together, I promise. 2 were teenagers, a boy and a girl, and the other was a very young man. All 3 wore soft grey jackets and crisp black trousers of the oldest, most prestigious company of ghost hunters in London, the Old Grey Lady of the Stand, the celebrated Fitz Agency. Their rapiers had complex Italian-style hilts, much more old-fashioned and expensive than ours. They carried neat grey briefcases emblazoned, like their jackets, with a Fitz symbol, the rearing silver unicorn. Lockwood and George got to their feet. The young man smiled at them. "Hello, Tony," he said. "This is novel. Haven't seen you here before." Tony? No one, in the 6 long months I'd known him, had so much as dared to call him Anthony. For a split second, I assumed there was a great friendship between this Fitz supervisor and Lockwood, and then I realised it was the other thing. Lockwood was smiling too, but not in a way I'd ever seen before. It was somehow wolf-like. Deep creases hid his eyes. "Quill Kipps," he said. "How's life treating you?" "Busy, very busy. What about you, Tony? You look rough, if you don't mind me saying." "Oh, nothing serious. Just a few knocks. Can't complain." "Yes, I imagine you haven't got time for that," the young man said. "What with all the people complaining about you." He was very slightly built, almost bird-like in his delicacy of form. He probably weighed less than I did. He had a small, rather upturned nose, a narrow, freckled face, and auburn hair, cropped severely short. He had 4 or 5 medals pinned to the the breast of his jacket, and the pommel of his rapier was a glittering green stone. Not that he could use a sword much these days. I guessed he was about 20, so his days of active service were behind him. His talent had most likely shriveled up and gone. Like my old leader, Jacobs, and all the other useless supervisors choking the industry, all he could do now was boss the kids around. Lockwood didn't seem overly perturbed by his jibe. Well, you know, he said, these things happen. So, what are you researching? Cluster of ghosts in a road tunnel under Moorgate, trying to figure out what they are. He eyed our open file. I see you're looking into something too. Yes. Richmond Examiner. Oh, I see. The notorious Sheen Road case. Of course, here at Fitz we tend to do our research before we take on a visitor. We're not completely stupid, you know. The boy at his side, a tall, gangling youth with a large, big-boned head and a thatch of mousy hair, laughed dutifully. The girl didn't respond. Humour, even the snide and easy sort that she was meant to side with, didn't seem like her thing. Her chin was small, slightly pointy. Her blonde hair had been cut short at the back, but she had a sharp flick angled across her forehead. Its tip almost reached her eye. I thought her striking, in a hard, plastic sort of way. She gazed at me. Who's this? New assistant, Lockwood said. Well, newish. I held out a hand to the girl. Lucy Carlyle. And you are... The girl gave a little laugh and looked away up the aisle, as if I was a crisp packet or something lying there that she found more interesting than me. You ought to watch out. Being with Tony, sweetheart, Quilkip said. His last assistant came to a nasty end. I smiled blandly. Don't worry about me. I'm fine. Yeah, but bad things happen to people he's close to. It's always been that way, ever since he was ever so young. He tried to make it sound casual, but his tone betrayed him. There was a catch in his voice, and I didn't understand. I glanced across at Lockwood. The way he stood was different. His studious unconcern had stiffened and begun something harder, less pliable. I knew he was about to say something, but before he could speak, George stirred. I've been hearing things about you, too, Quill, he said. That young lad you sent into the Southwark catacombs alone while you, quote, waited for reinforcements at the door. What became of that kid, Quill, or haven't they found him yet? Kipps frowned. Who told you that? Wasn't the way that happened. And the client who got ghost touch because your agents left an arm bone in the bin? The man flushed. That was a mistake. They threw it away, the wrong bag. Plus, you have the highest mortality rate of any Fitz team leader, or so I'm told. Well, it's not a great record, is it? There was silence. Oh, and your fly's undone, George said. Kipps looked down and discovered the unhappy truth of the statement. His face went bright red. His fingers strayed to his sword hilt, but he took a half step forward. Or he took a half step forward. George didn't move, but unblinkingly pointed to a quiet sign hanging on the wall. Quilkipps took a deep breath. He smoothed his hair back, smiled. Pity I can't close that fat mouth of yours here, Cubbins, he said, but there will come a time when I will. Okay, George said. Meanwhile, why not pick a fight with someone your own size? I suggested gerbil or a mole. Kipps made a small sound with his lips. He moved. Then the blade was in his hand. A blur of movement, but at my side, a tang of steel on steel. Lockwood scarcely seemed to have changed position, but the line of his rapier now stretched out diagonally across the table, intersecting Kipps's blade, pressed it down firmly. If you're going to mess about with swords, Quill, Lockwood said, you'd better be able to use them. Kipps said nothing. A vein pulsed halfway up his neck. Under the smart material of his soft grey sleeve, his arm exerted pressure. I could see he was trying to shift his rapier, first one way, then the other, but Lockwood was without appearing to expend any effort whatever, forestalling him. The blades remained still, their owners almost motionless. George and I and the two Fitz agents were, likewise, frozen, as if by some magical extension. All around us, the library's quiet hum went on. You can't keep this up forever, Kip said. True. Lockwood's arm twisted. He flicked his wrist. Quill Kip's rapier was snatched from his hand. It flew straight up and embedded itself, point first, in the ceiling. Nice, I said. Smiling, Lockwood returned his sword to his belt and sat down, leaving Kip's breathing loudly through his nose. After a moment he gave a little jump, hopping to reach the hilt of his hanging sword, but missed by several inches. He jumped again. A little bit higher, Quill, George said encouragingly. He almost got it. Then, at length, Kipps had to scramble up onto a table in order to wrestle his rapier free. His agents watched in silence, the boy smirking, the blonde girl stony-faced as ever. I'll pay you back for that, Lockwood, Kipps said when he'd returned to the ground. I swear I'll make you pay. Everyone knows Deeprak's going to close you down, but that won't be enough for me. I'll find a way of making you really suffer. You and those idiot friends of yours. Bill, Katie, come on. He spun around. His lackeys did so too. Like a small, poorly trained dance ensemble, they flounced away in unison towards the lift. Even when I worked with him, Kipps had a terribly short fuse, George observed. He's got to learn to lighten up a bit. Wouldn't you say so, Lockwood? But Lockwood was already buried in files again. His lips were a hard, thin line. Come on, he said. We've got a job to do here. We mustn't waste any more time. In the event that it was, in the event, in the event it was only another minute or so before the breakthrough came, and it was Lockwood himself who made it. With a low, long whistle of triumph, he pointed to the newspaper before him. There she was, Annabel Ward, a different photograph, a familiar splash of blonde hair, curves and gleaming teeth. This time she was wearing some kind of ball gown. This time she'd made the front cover of the Richmond Examiner 49 years ago. Annabel Ward, ex-boyfriend questioned. The case of Miss Annabel Annie Ward, the local woman missing for almost 2 weeks, now took a new turn last night when police arrested one of her former boyfriends, Mr. Hugo Blake, 22, a well-known gambler and society figure, is currently being held in the Bow Street police station. He has not yet been formally charged. According to police sources, Mr. Blake was one of Miss Ward's dining companions at the Gallops nightclub on Saturday the 21st of June, the night she disappeared. He is said to have left the club soon after Miss Ward and, under repeated questioning, has admitted driving her home. Sources say that the pair of them had been close some months previously, but their relationship had cooled. Blake's association with Miss Ward caused much comment in fashionable circles. Under his influence, she largely abandoned a promising acting career, although she had recently made attempts to find new roles in. Hugo Blake, I said softly, her former boyfriend. I bet he gave her the necklace. George nodded. And he took her home that night. Well, we know what he did there. Keep looking, Lockwood said. They arrested him, but he wasn't charged. For all we know, he might have gone to prison. Even though they didn't locate the body. It didn't take long to find an answer. A small piece dated a few days later tersely recorded that Hugo Blake had been released without charge. Scotland Yard sources were quoted saying that the Annabel Ward inquiry had run up against a brick wall. A brick wall, all right, I gasped. Those idiots. She was right there all along. They didn't have enough evidence to nail Blake at the time, Lockwood said, scanning the page. He was the only real suspect in the case, but they couldn't back it up. He claimed he'd escorted her home and left her there, but hadn't gone inside, and no one could prove otherwise. And since they didn't have the body or anything to go on, they couldn't press charges, so they let him walk. This is perfect. Looks like Blake's our man. George sat back in his chair. How old was Blake then? 22, I said. Per Annie Ward. Only 20. Well, that was 49 years ago. A long time. But he'd only be 71 by now. He's probably still alive. I bet he is, I said savagely. I bet he's living it up ever since he got away with murder. Until now, Lockwood said. He grinned at us. This is just what we need, as long as we treat it right. So, here's the plan. We contact Deepak. If Blake's still living, he'll be arrested. Meanwhile, we'll go to the papers and tell them the story. Killer caught after 50 years. That should make some waves. That's fine, George said slowly, but I'm not sure we should go public yet. There's a lot more research we could do, checking into Annie Ward's past. He patted the pile of the London Society magazines beside him. She's bound to be in here somewhere, and, if we're lucky, we can probably find some juicy stuff on Blake too, which might. You carry on. Lockwood scraped his hair back and got to his feet. Let me know what you find. Meantime, I'm going to go and talk to some people. We've lost 3 clients this morning. For the sake of the agency, I can't afford to hang around. Well, George adjusted his glasses doubtfully. Don't be too hasty, that's all. Lockwood gave us both a gleaming smile. Oh, I'll be careful. You know me. And that's the end of chapter 13. Gonna take a wee break here